Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is an ongoing lecture in an introduction to critical theory class. We will be dealing with Essay 1 from Carl Schmitt's Political Theology today. I'm using the basic University of Chicago translation of the text by George Schwab, who I met once and was a really nice man. But a couple of things that I mentioned already in my previous, I did an intro video just to kind of contextualize why are we talking about Carl Schmitt in general. So if you are interested in that and haven't seen it, maybe take a look at that. One of the reasons I'm using Schmitt in an intro to critical theory class is to really give us a good context for what's at stake in Germany during the 1920s when the Frankfurt School emerges. And one of the ways I'm doing that is contextualizing critical theory between more extreme right and left poles. Although, yes, I think that the general convention is that people associate critical theorists with the left for various reasons, mostly their engagement with Marxian materialism, and we will talk more about that. I've had some previous lectures there as well. So when we look at Schmitt right now, and then after I move through Schmitt's book, we're going to look at one of Vladimir Lenin's books as well as an example for the left. And then I think that we'll have a little bit more of just a historical context for the emergence of critical theory. Of course, critical theory morphs, and it says that it's going to morph. So if you go back to my Marcuse lecture, which was the first one, it was from the late 30s, there is an attempt to have our eyes on the spirit of the present, right? But the only way we can do that is by having some sense of the things that have happened in the past. And Schmitt went away, I think, for a lot of people. He was not an important thinker for liberals, and he's reemerged in theory circles in the 21st century to be very central. My use of him is not to claim that he is necessarily correct or anything, or to praise or blame him at this point. It's just to try and understand what he said. And that's why this is a contextualized reading. If you are new to this, if you're a student in my classes, when I pull up my text as I do here, I am modeling to you not only, I'm not just giving a script for my lecture, which is good and it's ADA accessible and things like that. That's good. But I step off of the script at times and explain things. What I'm performing for students is a contextualized reading, and sometimes in literary circles, what's called a close reading of a text. If you are engaging your own text, you should always be doing your own reading, not just taking it from me or the numerous podcasters who are out there talking about Carl Schmitt or Karl Marx or Herbert Marcuse or whomever, right? Yes, do your own reading first. Try to wrestle with the text first. Beware when you go to podcasters of the editorial ideology of the podcasters, of the journal editors that you're reading when you're reading about stuff, or the website editors. More so even than the writers themselves, right? Even, yeah, we should probably try to understand what kind of perspectives the writer, if we're writing about a different philosopher or critic, then yeah, like we're bringing our own perspectives to the text all the time too. So the claim is not to say that I can appropriate, or I can approach rather Carl Schmitt in some sort of objective fashion. In fact, I associate such ideology with particularly right wing and Euro Christian ideology that claims that we can reach a complete space of objectivity. But that's not to say that we can't try to be open in a critical sense of like, well, what is the spectrum of positions on this person's particular thought? Obviously, Jewish intellectuals continued to engage with Schmitt. Schmitt continued to engage with Jewish intellectuals. like Walter Benjamin, well after Benjamin had died, and after World War II, and after the horrors of the Holocaust were known, and his own anti-Semitism was known, right? So again, I it's not even just about generosity. Really, I think that we should try to be generous. That's a good thing to try and do as intellectuals. But I also have within my own disposition here, like think of what it might mean to be Jewish in the middle of the 20th century and to be engaging with somebody like Schmidt or somebody who's a Nazi, somebody who's completely on the opposite, somebody whose perspective might call for your own annihilation, and to continue to engage the kind of patience and rigor that it takes to do that sort of thing. Whereas in our present culture today, a lot of times when we confront something we don't like, we can just like click it off. And that creates makes our cookies feeds in our computers sort of put us into bubbles of only the things that we like, and then we don't have much tolerance for the things that we don't like, much less where those people are coming from. So generosity does not mean that you have to accept everything that another thinker that you disagree with thinks, but we need to understand at least what they're saying. Right, that's a big deal for me. Like a lot of people have all sorts of things to say about Nietzsche. I have a lot of disagreements with Nietzsche, but if you don't understand what Nietzsche is saying, and you go blow your horn about like what a jerk face he is, that only makes you look bad. Same thing with Freud. It happened to me the other night where somebody was just spouting off about how horrible Sigmund Freud is. And yeah, are there ways to criticize Sigmund Freud? For sure, absolutely, and lots of criticisms have been done, but the way that that person was doing it like showed that that person did not know anything about it and had already formed this whole opinion. And that's like that's anti-critical thinking, right? That's really dogmatic thinking. And so at a basic sense, yeah, we might not be able to reach complete objectivity. The whole subject of objectivity is part of critical theory itself. And but we want to try to the best of our ability to understand texts and thinkers on their own terms. If we disagree with them, that's great. That gives us fodder to make better arguments. So let's go on. I'm going to share my screen here, and got the text up here. Move this little bar out of the way and take a sip of coffee. It's morning time here in Denver when I'm making this. I will launch in. So my second Carl Schmitt lecture for the critical theory course deals with the first essay in political theology. And the essay's title is Definition of Sovereignty. This opening line is one of the most famous lines of this text. It gets repeated over and over again in current discourse. Sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, opens the text. Schmidt calls this a borderline concept, and a definition of sovereignty must be associated with it rather than the routine, rather than the normal. Right? However, with respect to the exception, Schmidt wants to say that the concept of the exception is integral to any theory of the state, not simply one applied to an emergency state or siege. This is really important. It's not just that the exception comes in when an emergency happens. One of the reasons why we're so interested in this in the 21st century is because we have current crises, whether they're environmental, whether it's something like COVID-19, whether it's something like 9/11, like over 20 years ago now. What we've seen in the 21st century is our increasing states of emergency. And with that has been a ratcheting in many places, especially in liberal democracies, toward the right. This is a global phenomenon. It is not just the United States. It has nothing to do with or not. It is not central, rather, to the rise of someone like Donald Trump, for example. It's a much larger phenomenon than our own domestic political situation. You can think Bolsonaro in Brazil a few years ago. You can think of Brexit. You can think of Modi in India, various shifts towards the right in European politics as well in different countries. So if you're a US student, we're having a bit more of an international discussion here. And certainly Schmidt's not a US citizen. So he says this is what's important, I think, about Schmitt is that when he's doing the theory of the exception and aligning that with sovereignty, he is saying that we must think of the exception at the very foundations of what the state itself is. So, the relation of the exception to the sovereign is, for Schmitt, a quote, systematic logical foundation. Schmitt distinguishes this against Robert von Moll, an earlier theorist of constitutional state, or the Reichsstaat, who had separated the exception outside normative legal theory. So again, this is partly Schmitt's conservatism, right, coming through here, right? He's reaching back into the mid 1800s, and he's not necessarily happy with a constitutional state, but he's also going to be arguing very much throughout this book against legal theorists in the liberal tradition. He's living in Weimar, Germany, where liberal democracy has entered the picture after World War One. It is a constitutional democracy. So we have the Weimar Constitution that he is not happy with on the right. The people on the left in Germany were not happy with that. Over to the east of Germany during this period, the Russian Revolution has one of the Russian revolutions, I should say, has happened, and the Soviet Union has just been formed in 1922, right? So the association of liberalism and liberal democracy with the defeat of Germany in World War One has left a precarious political situation, to say the least, in Germany of the time that Carl Schmitt is theorizing all of this stuff. So the people that he chooses to contend with, though, are people who would be oftentimes be considered liberals. Schmitt says that rather than pushing the exception out of state theory, the concept of the exception is foundational for the legal system, or to the legal system, rather. It rests, he will argue, with the sovereign. Right away, then, we can see why Schmitt might favor a strong sovereign decider as opposed to a constitution in the first place. A constitution may not so easily make a decision in the state of exception. He will later discuss Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution with respect to this question. He says, moves towards the particular concrete actions of the sovereign, or he moves to them, sorry, that's a typo. He moves to particular concrete actions of the sovereign in the next paragraph, opposing the abstract. Quote, the exception, which is not codified in the existing legal order, can at best be characterized as a case of extreme peril, a danger to the existence of the state, or the like. But it cannot be circumscribed factually and made to conform to performed law. The law can't conceive of the exception, that like the exception has to be outside of it, he says. So, but this is precisely why the exception must be associated for Schmitt with an actual sovereign who's capable of making a decision. Schmitt then pushes it further. The sovereign is the one who decides whether or not the exception is occurring. This is important. He's not just waiting for like a terrorist attack, for example, to take more recent examples. He's saying that foundationally at the foundation of the state, the sovereign must be there because the sovereign must decide whether or not we are in a state of exception. And that could mean putting us on a terror alert system and going all the way up to red, right? But to take an example from the Patriot Act after 9/11 in the United States, right? The terror alert system came in. We had the Patriot Act. There's a restriction on civil liberties, and a turn towards the right with the Bush administration, right? It was a big contested thing. At the time, I realized the Republican Party is in a new space where they don't like the neocons from the Bush era right now. We can talk about that in another lecture. But one of the things that we got as US citizens after 9/11 was the terror alert system, a reformation of the intelligence services in the United States as well. Um, so Schmitt, this is important. It's not just that the exception happens and it's at the basis of the state. The sovereign is necessary to be there for him because the sovereign does the deciding on whether or not we are in the state of exception. So the sovereign decided on the exception, as I emphasize. Schmitt is, I'm following his use of masculinist language in the text, so I will use the he along with sovereign because that's the way that Schmitt does it, and more true to the way that he wrote. I'm not unaware of more gender inclusive language, but I am sticking with the way he has it written and the way Schwab translated it. Um, so the sovereign stands outside the legal norm, but simultaneously belongs to it. Schmitt then claims, quote, all tendencies of modern constitutional development point towards eliminating the sovereign in this sense. Whether or not the sovereign can be banished in the contemporary world is, for Schmitt, a philosophical question that depends or demands inquiry into the history of ideas and metaphysical convictions. So this is what he's saying. He's characterizing his particular situation in the 1920s. He says we have seen shifts towards constitutional democracies, towards liberal democracies. And with those modern constitutions, maybe even going back to the US Constitution at the end of the 1700s, and various constitutions throughout Europe in the 19th century, that the trajectory has been among those governments to de-emphasize the sovereign or even to try to eliminate the sovereign. Obviously, he wants to have the sovereign there. So his built-in critique here is to say, like, because we're trying to eliminate this really important foundational part of the state, that might be a problem for why current states fail or why we have the kinds of violence that we have in the current world. So the question, he says, and he is trying to be, relatively open-minded here. He's like, maybe the sovereign can be eliminated, but we need to have a deeper look at history in order to do that. And this is why he's going to go back in the rest of his text, and he's going to be covering historical stuff. So he says the problem with existing histories dealing with sovereignty in Schmitt's time here, he complains, is that they are entirely abstract. He then traces the subject of sovereignty back to the 16th century French jurist Jean Bodin, a Catholic theorist. Schmitt says that according to Bodin, the bond between the prince, once the subject or estates is based on natural law, but that ceases in the exception or on the conditions of urgent necessity. So according to Bodin, again, the bond between the prince, once the subjects or estates is based on, it's like the care for the state is based on a bond of natural law. Natural law is going to situate him within a Catholic tradition going back to Aquinas and the late medieval or early modern thought as well. So that's important just to kind of note in terms of the history of thought. But he says that bond between the prince and the subject ceases in an exception or the conditions of urgent necessity. So Schmitt says people cite Bodin regularly, but upon close reading, if you actually read Jean Bodin, he is basing his thinking on Plato's Republic. So the question is then whether or not a prince must consult the estates or a congress in order to completely change the laws or declare war, since that would amount to a shared sovereignty or forfeiting rule to nobility or representatives. Um, it would be absurd to say sometimes the prince ruled and at other times Congress or the nobility ruled, according to Schmidt and Baudin. So therefore, Schmidt concurs that Baudin is correct to see that the prince is an absolute sovereign, and sovereignty itself as a concept should be regarded as indivisible. It can't be divided up between different places. Now, of course, like think of the US government, the president is not supposed to be able to declare war um, by his or her, only his at this point in history, uh, um, decision alone, although Barack Obama played with some of this. And we have like a 30-day rule now. And Obama, gave speeches about seeking Congress's approval, even though he didn't have to send drones into Syria because, and to exceed the 30-day limit of sending in some sort of intervention somewhere. One of his lawyer's excuses was that drones were not actually on U.S. citizens or U.S. soldiers. And so, because he wasn't putting the soldiers in danger, he could extend the time frame of interactions with Syria, right? This was a big controversial thing at the moment. He gave a whole speech about it. You can watch it on YouTube um, where Obama, cannily anyway, says that even though he didn't need Congress's approval for this, he sought it because he thought that was best practice. So again, just like the kind of weighing of decision of like, am I going to do this as a decider or am I going to present myself as somebody who is open to collaboration? Like Schmidt would say screw that, right? Like you do like this thought like this he would say that's the problem with democracies like the United States is that they have the judicial branch and the executive branch and the Congress branch and they want to have these checks on power and they want to divide up power into these different areas instead of just seeing power for what it is, which is something indivisible. It's a kind of force. And so we will come back to that idea numerous times in lectures and in readings throughout class this semester. We're not reading Machiavelli, but Machiavelli is a really important thinker in thinking about force or Virtue in his book on the Prince from the 1500s, right? From just right around the time of the Protestant Reformation, Machiavelli writes that, although it's published a little bit later. So Baudin is writing in the 1600s and claiming that the prince is absolute sovereign and the sovereignty is indivisible. Schmidt then asserts that he covered this in his book on the dictator, where he argued that 17th century philosophers who were developing international law based on natural law essentially had the same definition of sovereignty as Baudin. So he wants to have this like older historical context if we're going to think about what sovereignty is, because he's going to say as that the emphasis on sovereignty has been diluted in the past century or century and a half, perhaps, before his time. Um, At the base of all political order, no matter the kind of government, according to Schmidt, is the decision. Quote, after all, every legal order is based on a decision. And also the concept of the legal order, which is applied as something self-evident, contains within it the contrast of the two distinct elements of juristic, norm and decision. Like every other order, the legal order rests on a decision and not a norm. Schmidt then turns briefly to an oblique reference to the divine right of kings and the question of God's sovereignty. So it's this French Revolution stuff, right, where they kill the king. Schmidt says whether we're talking about God's representative on earth or a concept of the people as in a liberal democracy, it all seems to come back to the concrete action of the concept of sovereignty, which goes back to Baudin, who is responsible for that for which competence has not been anticipated. The next paragraph, if you're reading along with me, refers to a German argument regarding states' rights following the 1871 German Constitution, otherwise known as Otto von Bismarck's Constitution, which established the German Empire. For my current US students, a similar dynamic here might be the long contested battle between the state and federal rights visible in the current law with respect to abortion, the Dobbs decision in particular, which struck down the protection of abortion at the federal level and has now pushed it back to the states, right? And so depending on what state you live in, the abortion might be looking differently. In Colorado, where I live, we're we have a pretty good foundation to keep protecting the right to an abortion, but that's not the same in other places. So the assertion, or we could look, and again, I live in Colorado, so the recent assertion by Colorado and perhaps some other states, as this is all unfolding, right, that Donald Trump cannot appear on the state ballots for 2024's presidential election because he encouraged the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol in 2019 based on deliberately false claims about the 2018 elections results. So looking at the constitutional amendments from the 1860s, Coloradan lawyers and Republicans, they're not only Democrats. So just to let people know outside of this that there are people of Trump's own party who have supported this rejection of him from the Colorado ballot. And the ongoing outside discussion, if you don't know anything about this like political theology stuff, the outside discussion is like, well, that's not like that's an undemocratic move. Perhaps because what we're also wondering about is well, the Constitution says this, right? Is the Constitution saying that somebody who has participated in an insurrection cannot hold office? Um, it's a matter of protecting the state, right, from a force that even if popularly elected, has the intention to destroy the state itself, right? That's why it was put into place way back in the 1860s. Although if you do not understand any of that larger historical context, it's just like, no, like we don't we should just let the people decide, right? So this is being kicked up to the Supreme Court, who has not yet decided on it, at least at the time of me making this lecture. But I use that example to show you like what is being challenged are various from the different angles are the democratic process, but also the institutions that we have in place right now. Um, uh, and the decidability of a constitutional amendment, right? It's a lot bigger than just whether or not Trump is on the ballot in the particular state that I'm living in. It has to do with our faith in institutions. The far right's agenda in recent years has been to destroy the people's faith in a liberal democracy. And if we go back to January 6th a few years ago, whether or not, whatever Trump's involvement is in that, the agenda is to disrupt and destroy a faith in the transference of power in a liberal democracy. However, that chaos works for people on the far right, uh, it doesn't matter as long as the chaos happens and then we don't feel like we live in a democratic place anymore. Creates the chaos, it creates the exception, and then the decider must come in, right? So that's kind of the logic of the right wing there, at least the far right. So the endeavor is prompted as an as yet undecided ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. In Schmidt's terms, Donald Trump is claiming that he is immune from whatever the legal contestations arising from the January 6th situation because he was acting as a sitting US president. So he has for himself what Donald Trump is claiming is he's claiming that he is acting as sovereign. Like that's not the language that Donald Trump uses, but if we're thinking about it in terms of political theology, that seems to be what he's claiming. So in layman's terms, he's claiming that his position as president just made him above the law because he was acting in good faith as his appointed position as leader of the executive branch of government. In Schmidt's terms, Trump is asserting that the executive position of the United States is akin to a sovereign position. By Schmidt's logic, Trump could do or say whatever he wanted, including anything that inspired insurrection, if and only if he were the sovereign. If that, even if that version of sovereignty meant that he was entitled by having been previously elected by a sovereign people for whom he was acting as a representative, at least in Schmidt's terms, right? So one might also recall here George W. Bush's November 2004 claim after his reelection, quote, I have political capital and I intend to use it. He was saying that with reference to controversies about the border, controversies about our involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq, if I use the our, like the, if I identify as a US citizen there. Um, uh, so among the debates, he's George W. Bush at that particular moment was just saying like you reelected me and I'm gonna run with this now. Um, while such a claim was certainly alarming to those on the left at the time, George W. Bush has more recently come out as an ardent critic of Trump, as as have more recently elected Republicans such as Liz Cheney, daughter of George W. Bush's president or Vice President Dick Cheney, who suffered an ousting from her party in 2021, largely due to her opposition to Trump. I take the time in this lecture to note these figures because most of my students, I believe, are US citizens and they need a context for some of this stuff. Um, but I also I note these figures along with Republicans such as Robert Mueller, who did the Mueller report on the investigations into Russian involvement in the 2016 election, for example. I am citing intentionally Republicans who have expressed deep concern about Trump's anti-democratic tendencies. And this has been, at least in the current situation, a big divide. There's a kind of generational divide going on within the Republican Party or the right wing in the United States, where the younger contingent really, really dislikes the older neocons, I will call them, from the George W. Bush era. They've embraced a new kind of working class populism, even though it's debatable whether or not their actual policies really benefit working class people, but they definitely are able to draw on working class uh, um, uh, discomfort, ire, angst about the way things are going in the country, right? So they're drawing on working class anger and able to channel it into the newish generation of the Republican base, and it's of course that's part of the dynamics of that particular party. So back to the script here. While according to current election polls, Donald Trump appears to be number one in line for the Republican nomination for president in 2024, he refuses to debate Republican colleagues, and this does not seem to matter to the majority of Republican voters, at least polls right now. So in true, quote, decider endeavor, Trump was elected in late 2015 amid his calls to, quote, drain the swamp and to make America great again. As a political outsider, he soundly defeated Hillary Clinton, who had advertised herself perhaps correctly as the most qualified candidate. Certainly, no preceding US president had Hillary Clinton's credentials, if you remember back to her campaign. And I'm not saying this because I like her. I'm just saying that she was around. She had been the first lady. She had been Secretary of State. Like this is a political insider. And we can debate the Russian involvement in the election for sure, but at least according to the rules, the electoral rules, got Trump elected, even if more of the populace, more people actually voted for Hillary Clinton at the time. So I'm saying all of this because I have sat on academic search committees um, for professors and voiced my opinion against decider deans at times who choose less qualified candidates among many other personal experiences in institutions. Um, Sometimes people are trying to bring in somebody completely new to try and disrupt what seems to be stagnant, um, or as a tactic to not have to deal with the voices that they don't agree with. So for like that doesn't just happen in government and politics. I'm saying this is like something that happens in institutions. So for all the claims that the right wing ideology in liberal democracies wants to merit a pulling of oneself up by their bootstraps, at least in um, my experience has been that departmental jobs often go to the person most likely to get along with those in the hiring process, or the person whom the people above in the hierarchy of administration trust to support them. Such as the corporate power situation, and the office of the US president is little different here. Trump was hired as a new chief executive officer in deliberate refusal of Clinton among Washington insiders amid aggressive election interference by Russia, with what the Mueller report unambiguously shows, even in its redacted form, because if you read it, it's got a bunch of blacked out spaces, that the Trump campaign colluded in. While the Democrats called into question the election results based on Russia meddling, they simultaneously set the stage for Trump to build on their own skepticism of the US's ability to perform peaceful and democratic transition of power by asserting well before the election results were in that if Trump lost, it was due because to a rigged election, right? So this is just and again, I'm laying out the facts of the situation here, more than I'm taking a grandstand for my own political position here. Trump was calling the election rigged before the election results were in. Uh, Later, Trump capitalized on that blow to the faith in the democratic process by claiming that the 2020 election was rigged. My so This is a kind of dialectical reversal, right? The liberals unhappy with the election of President Trump, probably due to Russian meddling, which Trump administration seems to have colluded in, but they create a kind of atmosphere where we maybe can't trust the election. Trump in 2020, fearing he's going to lose, says if I lose, it's because the election is rigged. And then when he loses, there's a whole bunch of energy among his supporters to believe that the election has been rigged. But it wasn't only the right wing that did this, it was an earlier stage that was set up by the interaction of a foreign entity that intentionally wanted to disrupt the U.S. elections, right? So I'm not claiming like whether you agree or would you voted for Trump and you like Trump or want Clinton or wish like any of that sort of stuff. I'm just trying to point out the way that there's a kind of almost dialectical process of intrusion within the state's elections that then disrupts our faith in democracy. It's an attempt to create a state of emergency. And on January 6th of 2021, of course, it did um, erupt as a state of emergency. So again, my point here is not to side with either party, but to let my students understand that the far right agenda, whether or not Trump was personally aware, is to intentionally demolish the public's faith in democracy and a peaceful transition of power among competing political parties. The far right ideology is now dominant in the Republican Party, which has meant the traditional Republican folks like Liz Cheney or Robert Mueller have been ejected by a more extreme contingent that has gained congressional and House seats. and their raucous minority has demonstrated with the speaker contestation late last year in 2023, for example, with Mike Johnson coming to be the Speaker of the House, who's current for at least when I'm making this. This has demonstrated its effectiveness by threatening political death to any more moderate conservatives. It's just the way the extremism of the current right-wing party is. Again, I do not say this because I personally support Clinton or Cheney or Mueller or in my own politics, nor do I have some magical insight into Donald Trump's real ambition beyond simply just wanting to win in a zero-sum game. Yes, of course, I have personal opinions and personal politics, and you can glean some of them from my lectures. I am, of course, a real person. But this particular side is just to show you why a thinker like Schmitt himself, a far right religious and Catholic conservative, might be relevant in current times if we or I completely, even if we or I completely disagree with his politics on a personal level. This is a critical theory class. Critical theory is about trying to analyze the present. I've been starting to talk about Schmitt's first essay in his book, but I'm using a present example. And in doing that present example, I'm saying why it might be important to sort of be thinking about what this right-wing theorist said 100 years ago, especially because he was living in a constitutional democracy that completely fails in 1933 with the declaration of a state of exception. So back to the script here. Critical theory, as Marcuse said in earlier readings in our first lecture for this course, attempts to address concerns at the level of society. It also attempts to address them in the present. Reflecting on Schmitt allows us to simultaneously glean who the early critical theorists were up against on the right, but also how that right-wing ideology remains present in our own current situation. So in other words, you must be able to understand the political situation and the ideas that you claim to refute if you are going to do critical theory. Cancel culture's methods don't work here. Instead, we just have to make better arguments. So let's now return to Schmitt. Schmitt, at this point in his text, refers to Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which deals with the concept of the exception. Schmitt is complaining about the article's ambiguity because, on the one hand, it allows the president to declare a state of emergency, while on the other hand, it allows Parliament to do the same thing. According to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, which has a nice overview of this context with respect to Jews. I have it cited here in my notes here if you want to look down at the bottom of the page. They have a really nice article on just like the context of Article 48 for the Weimar Constitution. At this point in Schmitt's text anyway, this is Schmitt's right-wing critique of the liberal democracy at work. It doesn't give a clear picture of who the decision is to be made or who is to make the decision rather, or with whom the decision rests. It therefore expresses the question of sovereignty. So, quote, Article 48 is the actual reference point for answering the question whether or not the individual German states are states. He goes on, quote, what characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of the entire existing order. In such a situation, it is clear that the state remains while the law recedes. Because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos, order in this juristic sense still prevails, even if it is not the ordinary kind. Okay, this is like important parts of Schmitt's thinking. Again, he's thinking back to the 1871 German Constitution, in which states were developed, but then the questions becomes like are each of these German states sovereign, right, against the Imperial Confederation, if you want to call it confederation, against the empire. And again, I've contrasted that for the US context anyway, between federal rights, federal government versus states' rights, right? Where is sovereignty here? Schmidt says it has to be with the idea of the sovereign because the sovereign is what keeps the state together, even if all of the laws in the state are abolished or put aside for the state of the emergency. In the following paragraph, Schmidt clearly aligns sovereign authority with the state. The state suspends the law in the exception on the basis of its right of self-preservation, one would say. Because the decision declares the exception remains part of a juristic order, even if it is not the normative order. Quote, there exists no norm that is not applicable to chaos. For a legal order to make sense, a normal situation must exist, and he is sovereign who definitely decides whether the normal situation exists. The sovereign situates all law by having a monopoly on the decision. Paradoxically, authority proves that to produce law, it need not be based on law. He then turns to earlier philosophers, but before I turn to him there, just to go back to the example I was using of the current situation with uh, Trump being removed from the ballot in Colorado, right? There's a way of reading that situation along this same kind of sentiment of Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, although the amendments that we're dealing with for us come from the 1860s, right? Like 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment in there, which um, uh, deal with equal protection under the law, and also like with people who've participated in insurrection cannot um, uh, hold office again. So I think the way to kind of think about that with the Weimar 48 article is like, are we going to trust the Constitution and the amendment to say that if you have a political contender or political party and the agenda of that political party is to demolish the democracy itself, should that party be seen as a threat and removed from the ability to participate because of its demonstrated intentions against the republic itself? Right. So by Schmidt's own thinking here, Article 48 maybe should have like barred the Nazis from coming to power, but that I mean that happens later on. So it's just something to sort of be thinking about that when as like the Supreme Court is going to hear the case and the future of this year is going to like play out in the however ways it's going to play out. But I want us to be thinking about that if you're in my classes right now, thinking about like what is really going on and what's at stake there. Um, uh, and once we're thinking about it in these terms, then we're not just like, oh, the Republicans did this, or oh, the Democrats are like did that. Like we're not in that kind of state of ire. Although we might definitely have that kind of dislike. I want us to understand from a critical theory perspective what's at stake here by thinking about political theology. So Schmidt wants authority. He says you need to know where authority is so that authority can decide on the exception and the pausing of law, the elimination of law, the remaking of law, whatever it happens to be. So Schmidt blames an incommensurability with the thinking of the exception in John Locke's theory of the constitutional state. Again, John Locke is like the classic liberal philosopher, right? English philosopher. So he's essentially blaming liberalism for diluting the notion of the sovereign and ability to address the exception. Again, as always, I'm using liberalism as a political ideology where individual subjects have rights. Both traditional Democrats and traditional Republicans in the United States would fall under that category of political liberalism, even though on the street people say liberals versus conservatives, right? So just be very clear, I'm talking about liberalism. I'm talking about this philosophical idea that emerges um, in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that gets theorized by early classic liberalists like John Locke. And Schmitt doesn't like Locke. Schmitt says that he dilutes the notion of the sovereign. Kant also, according to Schmitt, had no place for the exception. Historically, this was a division between natural law theory and a, quote, rationalist tendency, which ignores the emergency. In Schmitt's wider thought, then, this will relate to international law and the concept of the political, which is a later book that he writes. Natural law theory was important for developing international law so that state borders and the friend-enemy relationship is hovering right behind what he's writing in this earlier book here. Schmitt wants to account for the irrational. Fascism tries to account for the irrational. Psychoanalysis tries to account for the irrational. The numinous and theological thought from my earlier lecture tries to account for the irrational. This is a broader thing than just a right-wing thinker at this moment in Weimar Germany. Um, uh, uh, Lenin is trying to introduce a rational, organized state with the Soviet Union, but over to the east. And so there's a lot of loaded information with being able to account for the irrational. Heidegger will want to do it in his philosophy as well, although we're not reading Heidegger today. So Schmitt is also critiquing instrumental reason. The critical theorists really have a lot to say about their critique of instrumental reason. Both the critical theorists and the right are critiquing instrumental reason. They're critiquing scientific positivism of the late 19th century. They both agree on that particular point. It's important to note there. Schmidt's critique of instrumental reason is that it has this tendency towards abstraction, just as constitutional theory or liberal democracies do. They push the idea of the sovereign into such an abstract place that there's no actual concrete decision that can be made anymore. So instrumental reason, then, he says, has a tendency towards abstraction and, quote, the exception is more interesting, he says, than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. It confirms not only the rule, but also its existence, which derives from the exception. In the exception of the power of power, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. He closes then this essay by citing Soren Kierkegaard, a Protestant theologian. So Schmitt is famously a Catholic and Assos Boden. And so I think that this is Schmitt kind of reaching out and saying, like, even some Protestants agree with me. Like, just look at Soren Kierkegaard. So Locke and Kant were Protestant thinkers, of course, and the development of liberalism and constitutional thought in England had been part of new theories of the state following the 16th century break with the Catholic Church. So that whole Protestant Reformation, the whole formation, the shift towards secular nation states, away from Catholic Church authority, the Catholic Church's counter-revolutionary efforts alongside that, counter-revolutionary efforts to the Enlightenment thought, which based everything on rationalism, right? So that's when he's critiquing rationalism here, and he's wanting an account for the irrational. He's not necessarily being romantic, although romantics made those sorts of claims against the Enlightenment thought and Enlightenment reason. He's reacting more recently to the development of scientific positivism and legal positivism in the 19th century. He's going to say a lot more about the legal positivists later on in essays in this particular book. I'm going to end my discussion there again. I realize that it might seem like like I've stepped out a lot to try and jump into the current American context with the unfolding of the 2024 election. I'm doing that for my students in critical theory class to understand why we do critical theory and what's at stake, and then also why we read, why it might be beneficial to read somebody whose politics I think probably many of my students would find really disgusting. Generally, those of us in the United States are not really into Nazism or Nazis. And so I'll just be sort of upfront there that yeah, like that is not where I come from, but that does not mean that we shouldn't take a thinker like Schmidt seriously. Okay, we will catch up with you in the next lecture, which will be about Essay 2. Have a great day, night, morning, evening, wherever, whenever you are. Bye.